It's 1238 hours on 27 March 2021. Cruz Charity Colleen. Last four digits of my social security are executive order 12866 minus the 12. Add in the 0 point, as you well know. And so far as my genetic lineage may be of concern, what I do know is that names that correlate with my paternal grandfather's name are associated with the manifest, or rather the information on those who arrived on the Mayflower at the onset of the country. Whether or not he is a blood relative, I am not certain, but insofar as he may be a blood relative through my father's bloodline, that would also put me in potential patrilineage with the individual that is now identified as the governor of Texas. This is information that has come to me in the last 6 months, but I understand it's materially relevant to factors related to who and under what circumstances I'm allowed to even talk to anybody since I've arrived in Texas. Other than that, my mother has informed me earlier in my life that from her side of the family, specifically her mother's family came from Cork County in Ireland immediately following World War II. Her grandparents did, and that's as much as I know about my bloodline. I do not believe in genetic testing. As for one thing, I think that the modalities in the United States are flawed, and there are political consequences for involvement in genetic testing with which I do not agree. Specifically, the manner and means by which genetic testing is used, presumably to identify people as being in some way mentally deficient, without allowing for an appropriate exercise or comportment within a consideration of the First Amendment. Specifically regarding freedom to worship, and an understanding that different people from different spiritual and religious traditions are going to have a different consideration how to apply their mental capacities and their cognizance around understanding their connectivity with their environment, as well as possibilities for processing information that might be coming from non-linear systems, which brings up my major problem and will speak to directly what I understand the charges were. I have never formally been informed about these charges, but I understand that there are allegations that I had at some point abandoned my post, as if I had in some way been assigned a post in some sort of command chain structure during my time of employ at the San Francisco Department of Public Health. I was never informed that I was assigned that in a post as any sort of military operationalization possibilities or functionalities. And I was never provided with verifiable chain of command, which leaves open the possibilities that it could have potentially been under the influence of some sort of foreign state actors attempting to infiltrate the American government and use civil service workers to accomplish the aims of undermining the federal government system. So I cannot and will not respond to whom I would otherwise be accountable if in fact somebody had identified me as being someone they posted and hence was subject to some sort of considerations of maintenance of a particular post. Not only that, my specialty was as a senior clerk, which means I had specific functions. And even within those, there were significant problems. At time, I could not specifically, officially identify and articulate, but I've since come to be able to, because I pursued my own personal research and investigation, as well as efforts at due process for redress of violations that occurred not only during the time frame in which I was employed, but also in consideration of the understanding that the terms of my employment were under fraudulent pretenses, specifically based upon the identification of me as being qualified because I had previously been identified as somebody that had a mental illness and hence was considered to be disabled for purposes of being availed of what were supposed to be recovery or rehabilitation programs for people that had disabilities. Specifically, my understanding is that the primary programmatic languages that are used for computer programming, specifically those that are within the language families that came from a particular line of computer programming that goes way back, including to the 1960s, and that I understand is in lineage with the kind of computer systematologies and organizational systems that were, among other things, created by IBM to be used by the Nazis during the years up to and leading up to and during World War II, specifically when it came to maintenance of the camps, the labor camps, the medical experimentation camps, and other kinds of camps identified as concentration camps that they used throughout their regime. And insofar as this is the case, the hierarchical programming languages also allow for a kind of programming functionality that ascribes a very gendered reference point and structuralism to the manners in which it attempts to effectuate its particular systematology. The is not only a number of gendered references in terms of the actual functionalities, but also in terms of the operational ability. And I believe that it has been disproportionately used to influence who it is that is allowed to have specific expertise in these particular programming regimes in order to identify the actual implementation of the programming structuralism. Now, I have understood and have met people, including during a time frame in early 2017, somebody I had met while I was in the situation I was in, who identified himself as a computer programmer that was studying higher education in the San Francisco Bay Area, the beginning of 2000, between 2005 and 2010. During that time, he was incapacitated. He was told that, likewise, that he had a mental disability. I do not believe he had a mental disability. I believe he was targeted with directed energy weapons in order to be incapacitated, because I believe he was on the cusp of some very cutting edge information as well as perspectives that could potentially have altered the paradigm that had been pre-existing up until that time regarding computer programming, and that it was a not only racially identified attack, but it was also one that potentially identified him as a specific kind of target because of his gender. Insofar as that's the case, he did describe to me his understanding of various processes around appropriation of various tribal symbols and or concept of symbolic language, and how symbolic language was used by different groups of people, and how there could potentially be possibilities, but were also potential perils in the pre-existing programming regimes that abused or rather misrepresented the importance of symbolic language when it came to computer programming. Insofar as that's the case, one of the things I am most dissatisfied with and believe is an actual material relevancy to why it was that I would have abandoned my post has to do with the concept of, among other things, penetration testing of emerging technology. In these gendered language references, there are intents to imbue subconscious processes or processes that are part of compressed data that is transmitted through networks that interface with people's physiology. And people that are particularly attuned or sensitive can pick up on the references or the symbolic commands that are part of that compressed data packet that's being transmitted. And it can allow for an actual visual representation to manifest not only in the unconscious, but that can also become consciously manifest. And dependent upon the actual circumstances in which they are involved, events can be contrived, and it can subliminally influence people to actually engage in certain kinds of behaviors, up to and including the kinds of behaviors that are being depicted in the kind of command execution that is part of those compressed data packets that are being transmitted through the so-called ether and through the networked functions, including the digital networked functions that do not necessarily require any sort of direct contact, and that are being picked up as subconscious cues by specific individuals. This is one of the reasons why they specifically and strategically refuse to provide certain people, including people with very high-level analytical capabilities, as well as particular kinds of ethic and or spiritual religious comportments, with specific expertise in understanding the structural programmatic regime that's at work. Not only that, but I also believe that there has been an effort to expand upon that and has been allowed to be prioritized as allowing for a form of visual representation of the actual command functions, specifically when it comes to commerce, i.e. fintech, but not exclusively. Also in terms of operationalization of other kinds of commands that could be used to execute any number of functions, including things that would be necessary as part of some sort of cyber engineering regime in terms of processes of automation that may be going on at various levels of manufacturing, and or when it comes to logistics and operational logistics regimes, when it comes to transportation of goods up to and including military goods. And so far as that's the case, these visual representations allow for a co-optation of what would be necessary dreaming features or necessary processes of visualization, including as processes of catharsis and or in comportment with people's natural spiritual inclinations, in order to try to manipulate and modify their behavior, primarily, I believe, to normalize them to acceding to a form of vice and or of physical placation as a substitute for any sort of political representation or political rights. Not only is this about a sublimation of their political rights, but the understanding is to try to almost reverse engineer consciousness to be at a more and more remedial stage of even comprehension so that they become more compliant. Now, even if there was an ethos or if there was a particular political paradigm that thought that such a thing was, for whatever reason, more socially viable, the problem then becomes the fact that there are too few people that actually have command that are capable of forestalling or mitigating against that from being usurped or hijacked so that it can be put into a context of operationalization that ends up serving the antithesis or the inverse purpose of whatever would have been the intent for allowing for that to occur. I will say it is unconstitutional. A. B. It completely is in conflict with anything that I understand to be my spiritual preference or anything having to do with what I understand to be an ethical comportment. And it is also, in a specific manner, a kind of eugenicism that is ill suited and is poorly planned out. Even if there was a justification for specific understandings of genetic engineering for personal development, or even for the purposes of healing, including what could be considered hereditary genetic flaws or genetic problems, and or even if there were people that believed that they had a preference or for whatever reason had a desire to maintain certain genetic traits that were specific of characteristics that they themselves had or that they within a specific or specified community had as a means to prevent against it being somehow modified or altered by some sort of inculcation of other kinds of genetic information. Processes and means by which this is accomplished are not only contrary to an appropriate utilitarian understanding of its possibilities, but are also in service of allowing for us to engage consciously in those processes. Our conscious engagement is necessary in order to mitigate or prevent against these things being used not only against us or being used against the structures within which we're involved, but for allowing us to be able to extemporaneously reattenuate or to recalibrate in order to prevent from a catastrophic event. I personally understand that there is a systematology that has prioritized catastrophic events or catastrophic consequences as being more of a priority in terms of maintaining regimes of corruptivity, including corruptivity of information, so that information is not accurately transmitted, and hence both serves the purposes of those that want to inversely engineer consciousness, but also the purposes of those that want to preserve a particular stake in an interest that they do not themselves actually have, as in creating duplicates or creating some sort of fraudulent misrepresentation or mischaracterization of them being qualified or capable to actually participate in the processes they're trying to insert themselves into, so that then they will be able to usurp and hijack the purpose and then appropriate it for their own use. One of the means by which they have attempted to accommodate this or to accomplish this is through use of programmatic regimes that are specifically sexualized in particular references, and then attempt to use sexuality and sexual coercion as a means by which to compel people to accede to their lack of qualifications, even in the course of actual execution, but also to allow for themselves to be harvested and expropriated so it can be credited to someone else. This ends up resulting in breakdowns. These breakdowns end up compounding and accruing. Now, at the time I was working in San Francisco at the particular job I was, my understanding is ex post facto that there was a specific kind of update and an increase in specific kinds of operationalizations associated with the job I had been hired for I had not been apprised of, while I had been apprised of other changes. But even if I were to just go on an understanding of the other changes with which I had been apprised, let me say that I repeatedly requested assistance from both the people I worked with at one level, but also the therapist that I was told I was required to see as part of an understanding of my stabilization, as part of what was identified, or as I say, misidentified or mischaracterized as a disability, in order to be determined to be compliant with the regime of stabilization, that I wished to get out of a situation where I was required or I was expected to take mind-altering substances that impacted my conscious engagement with the subject matter at hand, and also influenced the manner in which I did engage in processes of decision making based upon the manner in which I was able to absorb, assimilate, and process information as it was presented to me. I believe that, among other things, it made me less capable of doing the job I had been told that I was being hired to do. And so it was necessary for me to leave a situation where I was required to be on mind-altering substances in order to be able to successfully execute my job. I got no support. And this brings up the question of, well, in what interest was it to maintain me at a specific job function that was supposedly supposed to have a certain level of operationalization, with an understanding that there was also a concurrent requirement that I was supposed to be subjected to particular kinds of processes of input while I was under the influence of mind-altering substances and received no support. So the question is, the understanding of who would have identified me as being an abandonment of a post if I had this understanding, and this was the explicit understanding of my job function, even insofar as that explicit understanding was to belie an understanding that there was some other covert justification for maintaining me in a state of readiness. The truth of the matter is, I was not able to actually maintain the state of readiness because I was not provided with what I needed in order to accomplish it. I was refused any assistance with acquiring it on my own, which I would have been able to have done if I had been supported in a period of withdrawing from having to be dependent on the use of a mind altering substance in order to be able to exercise and engage my cognitive functioning. And not only that, it also brings up a question of in what function was I supposed to be posted? Were I to have maintained the drug regime, I would not have been capable of even maintaining the post. And by virtue of not receiving any assistance in getting outside of a situation where I was dependent upon or required to participate in a regime of ingestion of mind altering substances, they were not qualified to hold me to that post. So there's no actual justification. And in the meantime, what has happened is these spurious allegations have prevented and precluded against what would have been the post, which would have been understanding functionalities around regimes of programming in order to accomplish large-scale operations, including ones that were dealing with compiling information about a number of people with various kinds of characteristics so that it could be most efficiently applied. And in the processes of that implementation, understanding things about the actual systematology for the programmatic regime that may have presented perils and how there could have been a recalibration or recomportment in order to avoid those perils or to correct for those perils. So we were never able to get to the point, which is that the structuralism of the systematology that uses a particular kind of sexualized imagery while also refusing to provide appropriate sex education, which also includes an understanding of how our physical behaviors and how the means by which we engage in processes of socialization, how our other kinds of consumer habits, as well as the preference or priority we give to things like marketing, end up substantiating certain kinds of processes or certain kinds of social possibilities that then influence our capacity to actually be able to responsibly assume participation in a systematology that is based upon reference points connected to our sexualities. And without doing that, what has happened instead is there has been an effort to refuse to actually provide necessary information that is needed in order to successfully accomplish not only efficiency, but also a basic level of stability, which originally identified as being the intent. The first intent was to assure that there was stabilization, and then once there was stabilization, there was a means by which to maintain stability. But if you prevent and preclude against access to the information needed to even stabilize, you do not get to the point of having a stability, and hence you do not get to the point of being able to measure the accomplishments or the goals associated with monitoring and verifying the processes of maintaining stability. We never got to that point. And part of that is because there was a refusal to be honest about the actual processes and structures around the systematology to begin with. Why? Well, this gets to, again, who was it that considered me to be at a post? One of the things that has been happening with these particular programmatic regimes is this process of intentional infantilization. A process of not only allowing for a visual depiction of that which is actually not of the age of consummation, possibilities either legally or even biophysiologically, but also, I believe, as a form of a sort of intentional effort to undermine which would be otherwise identified as national characteristics associated with other countries that are allowed to be maligned as somehow being enemies of the state in ways that I do not believe can actually be justified. They cannot be justified if the United States is actually doing the job it needs to do in order to attend to the problems it has within its own structuralism and its own systematology that prevent against it being able to stabilize so that it is able to monitor the efficiency of processes of stability, of maintaining stability. We don't get to the point of stability, so we don't get to a point of maintaining stability. There is instead a focus on this model of catastrophization, which I believe is inherently about allowing for a misidentification of priorities that preference pursuit of that which it knows is illicit and giving a false indicator that somehow engaging in that as a risk activity has a particular kind of value that is able to offset for all that ends up getting lost because of a refusal to provide the foundation for stability or stabilization that then allows to provide for the processes by which stability can be maintained and hence can be monitored in order to determine efficiency and success. And so even if we take this out of a context of understanding it as being about using sex terrorism, specifically sex terrorism depicting minors, as a way to try to debase or degrade national regimes that see youthfulness as being a national characteristic, we are still unfortunately incapable of maintaining efficiency. And there was no way I could have maintained the post. It was either an illegitimate post or I was intentionally sabotaged at being able to have what I needed in order to provide for the safety and security and successful execution of any duties that would have been assigned to that post. And I've spent every day since then figuring out how and why and from whom that was allowed to come down.